Porter didn't believe them, but he had no evidence to back up his hunch. He knew that Kyle was being discharged from the hospital today, so he decided to keep both of them in the isolation room until Kyle got settled and until Porter could alert him that his wife was coming home. Besides, it might give Steve and Ginny a chance to believe that the other had blabbed and given away the truth, and maybe get them to talk more freely. Porter waited for Dan, Kyle's neighbor, to bring him home. Kyle cautiously made his way outside, still very sore from the savage attack. He waved for Porter to come into the house. Dan's wife Kim had come in earlier and cleaned up the hallway. The house was nice and inviting and smelled good. She smiled as she came out of the kitchen and invited everyone to the table for a home-cooked dinner. While Kyle appreciated Kim's efforts, especially cleaning up the reminders of the incident, he was uncomfortable being at home. He coldly recalled the events of the past week, up until the day of the incident, and the absence of those last fragments upset him. Kim and Dan cleaned up the kitchen and said goodbye. They agreed with the other neighbors that they would check on him every hour or two and make sure he was okay, at least for the weekend. They assured him that if he needed anything, he should call right away. As they were leaving, Detective Porter looked at Kyle and said, "She'll be home soon, you know that?" "I know. She's been here before." Kyle nodded at Ginny's back by the door. "I know. I held them off today to make sure you're okay and ready to meet her. He'll probably be with her." "I'm ready." Detective Porter noted the determination in Kyle's voice and the resolve in his eyes. "I want to show you something." Kyle led Porter into his studio. Porter was impressed with the abundance of sound, digital imaging, and computer equipment in the room. Kyle led him over to a computer workstation connected to a large mixing console. "This is my main sound recording setup. I have a lot of interesting files here. Some of them I've forgotten about until just a minute ago when I remembered. One memory has been plaguing me for the last day or two. Something had to do with a project I was working on but couldn't remember. When Dan and Kim left, it reminded me of another couple leaving the house. The one that left the house last Friday just before I was attacked. I may have been recording something when they came to call, and didn't turn off the recorder. Perhaps there is an audio file here that will explain the situation to you if something happened to me. I may have recorded everything from the time Ginny and Steve left here until the recording reached the limit, which was set at 12 hours. I have to take this to our lab. I wish you wouldn't do that. I'd be happy if you'd let me fight my own battles." Detective Porter considered Kyle. He wasn't suspicious. He didn't need to be because he knew Kyle intended to repay the spanking and humiliation Steve had lavished on him the previous week. "Kyle, I love to watch a good bare-knuckle brawl. But unfortunately, I will have to arrest both participants and witnesses. I also love to watch an outsider come back strong and take back what he lost. Steve is a big guy and he trains hard in this gym. It doesn't matter. Hey, what I don't know won't hurt me. Just give yourself time to heal longer." Kyle nodded. Detective Porter wished him the best and made sure Kyle put his phone number on the speed dial list of his cell phone. Fade to black. That evening, Steve brought Ginny home from the county jail. Her hair was disheveled and her clothes were disheveled. They both entered the house, but Steve waited by the door, and she walked alone into the living room. "Hi," she said meekly. Kyle just stared at her with an absent expression. "I heard you were hurt, so I came home early." Everything inside him was exploding. He wanted terribly to leap out of his chair and berate her for her feigned concern. For coming home 2 whole days early from a trip he shouldn't have taken to have an affair he didn't understand and couldn't approve of. That outwardly he showed only calmness. That's right. She was surprised at the lack of emotion on his part. After he'd begged her to stay, crying and covering her bag, she'd expected more. "Are you okay now?" "I'll be healed. We have to talk." "No, we don't. We talked last week." "Kyle, we can't just let this fester in our minds. You need to discuss this with me. I need to know what to expect. Expect separation and then divorce. Expect you to walk away from me and never be accepted back. Expect me to treat you with the respect any other person deserves. But without the love and care I felt for you a week ago." It was partly as she had expected, but she hadn't expected him to be so calm and unflappable. So she would stay for a couple days and then move out once she got her affairs in order. She set her bag down and turned to sit down. "I said you were leaving." She turned to look at him in bewilderment. "I meant now. Go. I don't think you understand what's going on here. I may have hurt you. I may have ruined our marriage, but I have given no rights to my house or property. I will move into the guest room, but I will stay here until I pack up my things and move out of here." Before she could continue her tirade, Kyle flicked the remote in his hand. The stereo system he'd installed throughout the house switched on and played a recording of last Friday's events. It was clearly audible as she wryly belittled him, saying that she was going on holiday with a real man and that he couldn't stop her. It was hurt Steve laughing as she told Kyle that she planned to have sex with Steve all week, if not longer, until she was satisfied. Kyle begged her to stay and sort things out, whimpering pitifully and trying to hold on to her bag. As she left, her heels clicked noisily on the floor, and Steve said, "Tough luck for the little wimp." After the door slammed shut, there was the sound of the door opening and Ginny called out in the distance, "Come on, Steve." He withdrew and then could be heard saying to Kyle, "Just so you don't get any ideas of following us or trying to stop us." This was followed by the sound of Steve beating Kyle. Steve could be heard grunting as he delivered numerous blows to Kyle's ribs, and even worse was hearing him taunting Steve, telling him how he was going to beat the crap out of him tonight. As he walked away, Steve left a parting look. "Now your head is as broken as your feeble heart. Lie in your blood and think for an hour or two. You'll realize she needs a big dog to make her happy. But she'll come back to you when she realizes that a big male dog can't stay with one bitch for long." Kyle looked at an exhausted Ginny. Steve appeared in the doorway, looking at Kyle with a frown. "Why, you sneaky little coward." Kyle stopped him by waving a finger. "Porter doesn't have the tape. But he'll get it if I want him to. I don't want him to put you in jail. I want a second fight." Ginny was horrified. Steve grinned from ear to ear. "I'm proposing a bet. You both have to agree and your terms will be different or there will be no deal and Porter will get the sound file in 10 minutes via email. In 6 weeks, as soon as the cast comes off my arm and my ribs heal? You can't win." Steve shook his head. "No, I couldn't win after that cheap shot last week. This time we're going to fight fair and square. No sneaking up from behind and cold stabbing an unsuspecting victim. You coward. You'll see me coming and you won't be able to stop me the way I was able to stop you lying unconscious last week. Are you sure you can win on those terms? With your bare hands man to man, no weapons? I'll tear you apart. Bet on your gem." Steve looked at him again. He wasn't willing to take a risk on this scale. He owned the gem and the building it was in. There were several offices in the building that were profitable tenants and it was an incredible cash cow. His apartment occupied the top floor of the building and was a luxurious space overlooking Long Island Sound. But Steve didn't believe this guy could be anything but a competitor to an athlete like him. Sure, David had defeated Goliath, but David had the slingshot. Bet all your gems. Steve paused, reflecting on his burgeoning business. Not only did he have a flagship club, but he had 6 branches across the city, and they were thriving to the point where he was thinking of selling the franchise. What? Put all that against your house and all that fancy electronic equipment? Are you out of your mind? No, my house and equipment are not for sale. You're putting this record and all copies on the line. You're staking jail time and the loss of all your assets later in civil court. You're putting your business, your real estate on the line. A silence hung in the room as Steve realized he was going to have to fight for his freedom. And your cars. Steve had several vintage and late model Corvettes, one from each decade starting in the 50s. They were his pride and joy, and the whole town knew it. The stakes were incredibly high, but Steve thought Kyle was nothing. Done. And the lake house? Okay, all the cards are in your hands, aren't they? I'll risk everything. But there's really no risk. I'll grind you down. Kyle looked at Ginny. She had listened to him rolling stakes for Steve, and now she was getting ready to hear her take her chances. If I win, I want everything and for you to leave. Not to contest the divorce, not to take anything from this house or our cottage, not a dime from our bank account or investments. You have to watch every minute of the fight. You also have to live with Steve until the fight, and if I win, for a whole year afterward. Ginny flinched but nodded in agreement. She knew Steve was strong. But she also knew what kind of shape Kyle was in, how much he ran. She'd seen him handling spools of cable and pipes backstage that usually required 2 people to move. Kyle? He looked at her with the same blank expression, and she felt bad again that she couldn't understand him. What if I'd rather bet on you? You already made that choice last week. This week your choice is freedom or prison. Fade to black. The weeks passed quickly, and Kyle spent them recovering his strength. He started doing lighting projects again. His absence from the scene had left a bit of a void, and his return was welcomed. At every turn he was asked about the attack, but he refused to give details. The circumstances surrounding his wife were the source of many rumors. It was widely known that she was now living with Steve. There were those who suspected the truth and waited to see what Kyle would do. He was known for his stubbornness, and none of these people believed that he would begrudgingly endure the beating and kidnapping of his wife. The stories of Jeannie abandoning Kyle in his hour of greatest need, and the fact that he was so well loved made her a pariah in the theater community. It was the night of the fight. Kyle entered the gym in a t-shirt and sweatpants. Steve was already at the ring, wearing ridiculous-looking boxer shorts and a t-shirt with the gym's logo on it. Jeannie sat sullenly at the table, holding an envelope containing Steve's titles and contracts, his betting stakes. Steve was surrounded by many of his friends, as well as the staff and clients of the gym. They were all cheering him on, encouraging him, and teasing him about the easy job he had ahead of him. They clamored even more when Kyle entered the room. Kyle, with his light runner's body, looked unimportant compared to Steve's bulging, strong body. Kyle walked past Jeannie and placed his folio of contracts and records on the table next to Steve's desk. Climbing into the ring, he said, "Let's go. No calls, no referees, no stoppages until one of us is defeated." Steve smirked, snuck to the ropes, and held out his hand to Kyle. Kyle looked at it and, without taking it, delivered a punch to Steve's nose. Steve looked up, stunned, a trickle of blood flowing from his right nostril. "No bells," said Kyle, biting Steve again. Steve's imposing physique made him look impressive, but he wasn't as flexible as Kyle. His stiff frame slowed his reaction time, and he moved worse than Kyle. Steve ran after Kyle but couldn't get his big body to react fast enough to pin down the speedy Kyle. Every time he got close enough to land a punch, Kyle made him pay for it with a flurry of jabs to the face. Soon Steve's face was swollen and he slowed down his attempts to corner Kyle. Steve soon realized that his position was no better in the center of the ring. Kyle didn't look that big, but he was also a short man and had a significant advantage in punching distance. Plus, he kept up the pace while Steve was tiring from a lot of punches, the best of which barely reached their target. As Steve tired, Kyle began to throw punches to his body. It wasn't long before Steve's arms grew heavy and drooped. Kyle pulled him apart. "That's enough, Steve. You can barely stand. You can't defend yourself. You've lost." Steve stared at him, breathing hard. Both eyes were swollen shut. His nose was bleeding, and there was a nasty cut under the only eye that could still see. "Surrender now and I'll leave you more than you deserve. Apologize to everyone. Give it up now and I'll take this hall, this building, and the 58 convertible. You keep the rest. If you don't give up now, I'll knock you out and keep everything." Steve knew he was defeated. His head was already down as his body sank to its knees. "I apologize." Kyle walked over to the desk and pulled out the paperwork for the building, the gym, and the title to the 58 vet. Taking the keys in his hands, he looked around at the disbelieving gathering of Steve's friends and associates. "I'm closing the gym and opening a theater school here. I will honor the employment contracts you have with Steve, but will expect you to work for me in a useful capacity. If he transfers you to one of his other gyms, I will release you from your contractual obligations here. For those of you who rent the building, I will honor the terms of your contracts and negotiate fairly when they are up. However, there will be a different atmosphere here, as this space will be converted into a theater. If you choose to cancel your lease due to these changes, I will release you." Ginny stared at Kyle incredulously. They had long dreamed of creating a community of theater professionals and enthusiasts dedicated to the advancement of the theater arts. Not only was he realizing their dream without her, but he had the means to do so thanks to her betrayal. She felt completely abandoned. She suddenly felt very lonely and cold. The color disappeared from her face and she stared at a battered Steve. There wasn't a drop of pigment on his face, already blackened with bruises and reddened with blood from the cuts his friends had only bandaged. Steve had never looked so pathetic, so broken. Kyle had never looked so brave. There was no gloating or arrogance in him, just the cold confidence with which he did everything. Fade to black. 6 months later, Ginny was still living with Steve. After the fight, neither of them were interested in the other sexually. Nevertheless, they had to live together as part of their bet. It was a tepid coexistence, as each saw the other as the cause of the failures in their destiny. Ginny quickly and quietly moved out of her house, which was now completely Kyle's. The divorce had been finalized a long time ago. Kyle hadn't spoken to her since the fight and didn't answer the phone when she tried to call. Steve continued to build his business, but growth slowed when word spread about his failure in the ring. He saved what he had by offering season ticket packages aimed at seniors and moms who didn't work out outside the home. 2 of his satellite gyms closed and the rest lost their glamour. He'd lost his penthouse when his building was taken over by Kyle, and had been forced to move into a small apartment next to one of the remaining gyms, which now served as his flagship. Now his swagger wasn't as cocky and often wasn't even present at all. Instead of the aura of confidence he had exuded before the whole Kyle episode, he seemed much less menacing. His mood was often sullen and he was constantly worried about finances, as he no longer received rent from his downtown building to support his other businesses. Kyle successfully converted the main gymnasium into a great theater space. He converted smaller areas into rehearsal spaces, stores, and dressing rooms. He carved out space for a small, intimate cabaret theater, and opened a coffee shop with a small stage on the second floor. The summer season was already planned and the town was buzzing with excitement about the opportunities Kyle offered for actors and audiences of all ages. As expected, Kyle had been so consumed with setting up store that it seemed as if he had forgotten about the entire attack that had taken place a partial year ago. But he still remembered everything clearly. He remembered every night when he walked through his own front door. He remembered every night when he fell asleep in his lonely room. He remembered every time he walked into the theater where he and Ginny were working on a project. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the memory that they had been together half their lives, and still didn't know the woman he thought was the love of his life. One evening he was working on a light story in his studio when the doorbell rang. It was Ginny's brother Peter. Peter lived in Boston and rarely left the city. In all the time he and Kyle had been together, he had only visited Ginny twice. His presence meant something was wrong. "Hey Kyle, I'm sorry to bother you, but I really need to talk to you about my sister. Would you mind if I came in?" Sensing the urgency in Peter's words, Kyle stepped aside and escorted him into the living room. He offered him a cup of coffee or a beer, but Peter declined. "I'd really like to get to the reason I came to see you. I'm very sorry things have gone so badly between you two. I thought you two were a wonderful couple. And I want you to know that our entire family was shocked by my sister's sudden change of heart. She's determined to hold up her end of the bargain. She realizes she was stupid to give you up for an affair. But her life with Steve just isn't right. She chose Steve over me," Kyle muttered. "It just seemed appropriate that she get exactly what she wanted. She chose to have an affair. She made a mistake and betrayed you brutally, and no one blames you for how you reacted. She did a stupid thing, but life with Steve is torture. And now he's also given her physical strength. He hit her and broke her nose last night." Kyle hated to hear that Ginny was being abused. He wanted her to come to terms with Steve's stupidity, his early American style of dress, his life as a gym rat. He wanted her to be disgusted by Steve's sexist comments and expectations, his selfish attitude, his inexhaustible vanity. "Take me to her," he said to Peter. "She's in the car. She doesn't want to come in. She's too proud. She didn't want me to come in and she's really mad. I just want you to release her from her promise to live with Steve for a year. She doesn't even want to do it, but I think he'll hurt her more next time." Kyle slowly stood up and headed for the door. Peter followed right behind him. "Please talk to her gently, Kyle. She's been through hell, and though she brought it on herself, she's suffered enough already." Kyle walked over to the car and opened the door. "Please come in," he said to Ginny. "We need to talk." Ginny reluctantly but slowly got out of the car. She walked into the house and Kyle whispered to Peter, "She'll be fine. Go to Steve's and get her things and bring them back here." Kyle led Ginny into the kitchen. A flood of memories came over her. Kyle hadn't changed a thing. Everything smelled the same, looked the same, felt like home. The only difference was that all of her pictures were gone. Kyle had replaced them with pictures of her family. Tears came to her eyes, for to be cut out of her home like that was just awful. She'd considered it her home since she hadn't had time to get a new one yet, and she'd considered life with Steve a temporary hell. She wasn't replaced, just cut out of this place she had once loved. Kyle was well aware that she was crying, and although he was touched by the woman who was still the greatest love of his life, he didn't go to Jenny. Instead, he poured her a cup of coffee and made her coffee the way she had always liked it. He made her coffee like no one else, not even Jenny herself. The smell of the steaming brew in the mug and the perfect blend brought her back to herself, reminding her once again how perfect her husband and the life she had left behind were. You're moving away from Steve. Peter is picking up your stuff now. You're going to move in here. You can stay in the little apartment we built over the garage. You'll be independent. When you get well again and start working, you can move out whenever you want. If you want, I'll find you a job at my new store. If you decide not to move out, you can stay here as long as you want. I do not wish to witness any romantic relationships of any kind, although I intend to bring dates home if I wish. I expect you to take good care of your apartment, show care for my property, and respect our neighbors and guests. These are the only terms of living here. There will be no rent, no expectations or promises of any relationship other than a promise to observe decorum. Somewhere inside of me, I will always love you. Elsewhere, I'll always be afraid of what's in you that could have betrayed me the way you did. I didn't want Steve to bully you, so I don't expect you to finish your year with him. She swallowed back a tear and looked into Kyle's eyes for the first time in months and thanked him. She mumbled something about moving in with Peter, but Kyle reminded her that the New York theater scene was her life, and she couldn't exist without it for long. She realized that he was right and agreed to move in. Wait here. I'm going to help Peter. Make yourself at home. The significance of his last statement was music to her ears. Fading to black, Kyle pulled up behind Peter's car. He walked straight to Steve's house as if he were his master. Steve didn't like it, but there was nothing to object to. He had hit Jeannie, and now he found himself here with her brother, and the guy who had publicly flogged him. Either of them could have sent him to jail for abuse, and Peter was using this moment as a slave driver. Steve carried Jeannie's things to the car. Peter helped him pack, but it was Steve who carried the stuff. There wasn't much stuff, as the terms of the divorce agreement left her with only a couple mementos and clothes. Steve returned to the house after the last trip. He began to talk. Don't say a word. Kyle was seething with rage. You know what's about to happen now, don't you? Steve didn't want to hear it. You broke her nose. You hit a little woman and ruined her face by breaking her nose. Stand up. Steve looked at him, but obediently stood up. Kyle stood up as well. He stepped up close to Steve, and before Steve or Peter could anticipate what would happen, Kyle broke Steve's nose with a swift right punch. Shade of black. 3 years later, Jeannie is still living in Kyle's apartment. She's not dating but is thinking about starting. She is one of Kyle's most valued colleagues, working as a manager, director, and teacher at his theater center. She considers Kyle her best friend and respected boss. She has written a play that has been successful in regional theaters and published by a major publisher. She is financially independent and is becoming like the old Jeannie. The fact that Kyle had welcomed Jeannie back into his life was taken as a signal by his neighbors, his family, and the theater community. She was accepted in those circles in almost the same status as she had been all those months ago, though no one had forgotten where she had been. Steve sold his business and, after some reflection, found that he didn't like what a jerk he had been. He eventually found a use for his college degree in physical education by taking a job at a local elementary school. He became passionate about working with children with physical disabilities and other special needs. He became a Special Olympics coach and volunteered in the physical therapy department at a local children's hospital. Kyle's theater project has flourished, and his programs have been accredited by the local university. His programs for high school students are highly regarded and have become very profitable. His professional productions pack full houses and attract the attention of New York's top critics, who usually don't stray far from Broadway theaters. Kyle and Jeannie lived close to each other, but they rarely spoke to each other. Although he took care of her when she needed help, he did so out of a sense of responsibility. She was the love of his life, and he couldn't see her in utter shambles, beaten down and rejected by the society that ran the profession she lived for. Having gotten her into a safe place, he wanted nothing more from her. He dealt with her professionally after all. She was good at what she did and was a great asset to his company. However, he couldn't see her in any other light, and rarely interacted with her even on a friend level. Jeannie accepted her position in Kyle's life as a blessing. She wasn't in jail, she was working, and she could at least make it up to Kyle in some small way. It seemed to her that living next to him with no chance of him ever loving her again was better than the alternative. It was impossible to truly make it up to him, but perhaps if she stayed here until she saw him happily settled with a new love and perhaps a family, she could find peace. It was inevitable. Kyle had fallen in love with a divorced woman he'd met on the Cape. She lived in a neighboring cottage with her brother's family and young daughter. She moved in with Kyle in the fall, and in October they were married in a beautiful but small ceremony in the backyard of Kyle's house. Jeannie declined the invitation to attend the ceremony, but watched the proceedings from her bedroom window, the only window that had a view. She cried bitter tears as she recalled the events that had brought her to this moment. And now the last chapter was complete. Tears fell on the last small suitcase. The rest she had already loaded into the rental car parked outside the garage. When everyone had gathered at Kyle's house for dinner, Jeannie picked up her bag and got into the car. Before she drove off, she took one last look at Kyle's house. She knew he would find the goodbye letter she had left on his desk as soon as she returned from her honeymoon. She checked her bag one more time to make sure she had her ticket, passport, and signed contract for her new job as a stage manager in London. Kyle had a new life now. She shed one last tear and set off to find hers.